Having a good Sabbath at home. My first full-time job out of college was unusual. It took me a long time to fully appreciate how unusual because I didn't have much to compare it to, but it was a strange place to work. That said, one aspect of the job that I genuinely appreciated was that the business owner, my boss, was a man of faith and led his business through faith. While his beliefs and mine differed, we would regularly start meetings with prayer, and he clearly was someone who put God first and was completely upfront and unembarrassed about how he felt that God was leading him and his business. I bring this up because he also led a leadership development program while I was there, and I joined. In one session, he brought in a guest speaker whose message has stuck with me even now, 6 to 7 years later. That speaker used the book of Nehemiah and Nehemiah's example to highlight 7 aspects of godly leadership, and I found the message compelling. Not compelling enough to remember his 7 points, but compelling enough to remember the theme of the message. So I'm going to borrow that theme this morning and look at 7 aspects of godly leadership that Nehemiah demonstrated as his time as the governor of Judah. These are my 7 points, but you could draw your own points, and I'm sure there are 77 points you could draw from Nehemiah's story. On a personal note, I find Nehemiah a fascinating book and an extraordinary person from whom we can draw many lessons. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. We're going to spend the majority of my message today in this book, so if you want to drop a marker there, we will be going through the book to draw out these aspects of leadership. With that all said, as introduction, let's start by turning to Nehemiah 1, and we'll look at Nehemiah's call to action. We see that in the first 3 verses of Nehemiah 1. Let's look at Nehemiah 1, starting in verse 1. It says, "The words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire." This introduction to Nehemiah shows us the state at which Jerusalem is in, and we can see that the city and its people are in pretty dangerous circumstances. Without walls and gates, the city is essentially defenseless. We also get an important timestamp. This report reaches Nehemiah in the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. So this is 13 years after Ezra left for Jerusalem. We know that because in Ezra 7:8, which you don't have to turn to, we read that Ezra left for Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. I believe that the 13-year timestamp is important. We need to keep in mind that the Jews in Jerusalem hadn't just returned when Nehemiah receives this report. They have been struggling for years by the time Nehemiah hears of what is happening from Hanani. With that initial context out of the way, let's look at point number 1. Good leadership starts with a strong relationship with God. Number 1, good leadership starts with a strong relationship with God. We've already read Nehemiah 1, verses 1 through 3, but let's look at the next few verses. We're already here, so we'll look at verses 4 through 9. We read, starting in Nehemiah 1, verse 4, "So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven, and I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, that the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather from there, and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Nehemiah's reaction to this horrible news that we read about in verses 1 through 3 was to pray and fast. But there are a couple key elements in Nehemiah's prayer that hint at his character beyond this. Nehemiah demonstrates a repentant attitude and has the humility to include himself. We read that he says, we have acted very corruptly against you, including himself. Nehemiah knows God's word. There are a couple places where God tells Israel that he will scatter them if they are unfaithful. But one likely verse that Nehemiah is referencing here in his prayer is Deuteronomy 4, verses 25 through 27. And then Nehemiah took this news personally. We'll take a look at this in a second, but he was in a privileged, comfortable position. But he mourned the news for days and prayed and fasted day and night, even though he was not directly connected to the people in Jerusalem. And arguably, he could have stayed comfortable in the capital of Persia, far away from the issues in Judah. Let's look at point number 2. Good leadership starts from a position of service. Number 2, good leadership starts from a position of service. At the very end of chapter 1, we see that Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. What does that mean? Well, in the greatest source of human knowledge available, Wikipedia, in their article on cupbearers, we get the following definition. A cupbearer was historically an officer of high rank in royal courts, whose duty was to pour and serve the drinks at the royal table. On account of the constant fear of plots and intrigues, such as poisoning, a person had to be regarded as thoroughly trustworthy to hold the position. He would guard against poison in the king's cup and was sometimes required to swallow some of the drink before serving it. His confidential relations with the king often gave him a position of great influence. While the traditional role of cupbearer varies slightly culture to culture, it is generally considered a position of service that comes with high honor because that person must be trustworthy, not just to protect the life of the king and queen from poison, but to also hold their secrets that naturally get shared in the dining room. We can see how Nehemiah's position of service impacts his relationship with the king in Nehemiah 2. Let's look at the next chapter of Nehemiah. We'll look at the first 3 verses here. We see this relationship that Nehemiah has with the king. It says in verse 1, and it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid, and said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire? Artaxerxes reads Nehemiah's mood, and he can sense that something is off. We might read this and be tempted to think that Nehemiah is really telegraphing his emotion by moping around, potentially huffing as he pours the king's wine, groaning just loud enough for the king to hear. But I don't believe that's what's happening here. We see that Nehemiah is dreadfully afraid when the king reads his mood at the end of verse 2. This is not a man that you want to play with or act up around. While Nehemiah's job may seem prestigious from the outside looking in, it would have been considered dangerous and difficult. He would have had to put his life on the line for a king that he was servant to, who may not have been a good man, but he would have been expected to protect and serve no matter what he thought of the person privately, like an ancient Secret Service member. We know from other scriptures in the Bible that service is a key component of leadership. And let's just look at one of those. We'll hold our place here in Nehemiah 2, but I'd like to just look at one very familiar passage. We'll turn to Matthew 20, and we'll look at verse 25, or start there. It Some context as we're turning there, just one of the many examples where the disciples are trying to position for a position of supremacy and leadership amongst their peers. In this case, we're looking at James and John, and they want supremacy, but we read Jesus' response in Matthew 20, verse 25, and we'll read through 28. Matthew 20, starting in verse 25, it says, "But Jesus called them to himself and said, 'You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many.'" Reflecting on Nehemiah's role as a cupbearer, we see that his position as a servant was setting him up well for the role that he was to adopt in Judah. He learned humility, discretion, wisdom, and many other lessons serving the king, so that when it was his time to lead, he was ready. And that leads to point number 3. Point number 3 is that good leadership requires planning. Good leadership requires planning. In Nehemiah 1, we read the majority of Nehemiah's prayer, and then we see in Nehemiah 2 that he is serving the king. But I want to just turn back a page and look at Nehemiah 1, verse 11, the last verse of Nehemiah 1. And I just want to draw something out here. If you would turn back to Nehemiah, we'll look at chapter 1, verse 11. It says, "O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer." Nehemiah could have ended his prayer just by asking God to be with those in Jerusalem and help them figure it out. Maybe he could have ended his prayer by asking God to guide Ezra's hand or the leaders that Ezra had been instructed to be put in place. But that's not who Nehemiah is. We see him ending his prayer by asking God to grant him mercy in the eyes of the king and to prosper. Nehemiah is going to act. It likely wasn't an accident that Hanani ran into Nehemiah in Shushan. Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer, which puts him in a position to do something. We see what that something is when we look at the next chapter. Before we look at what Nehemiah actually does, I want to make one other point. In Nehemiah 1, we're told that he receives the report from Jerusalem in the month of Kislev. And in Nehemiah 2, we see another timestamp. We read that he is serving the king in the month of Nisan. There are, depending on the year, 3 whole months between Kislev and Nisan, Tevet, Shavat, and Adar, meaning that Nehemiah has been thinking about this for at least 90 days and potentially up to 120 days. It's a little complicated, but there's an intercalary month known as Adar 2, which could change the timing of when this is. But the point is that whether it's 90 or 120 days, he has given himself time to plan. And with all that context, let's look at Nehemiah 2, verses 4 through 9. Starting in verse 4, we read, "Then the king said to me, 'What do you request?' So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it.' Then the king said to me, the queen sitting also beside him, 'How long will your journey be, and when will you return?' So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Furthermore, I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy.' And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Then when I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters, now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel." This passage starts with a seemingly simple question: what do you request? But that can be one of the most difficult questions to answer without preparation. It's one thing to know that there is a problem, but good leaders are prepared with an answer to the question, what do you need? Verses 11 through 16 also reiterates Nehemiah's tendency to survey the territory and plan. It's one thing to outline what you need while you're in Shushan, away from Jerusalem, but once he actually arrives, he takes the time to privately view the walls and gates for himself before outlining his plans to others. He doesn't rush into anything, which is going to set him up for success down the road. Point number 4. Point number 4 is that good leaders delegate. Good leaders delegate. Nehemiah 3 describes the actual process of rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem, and while we're not going to read it, there is an important detail about the work outlined in chapter 3. Nehemiah spreads the resources and delegates the task of rebuilding to the families that are there in Jerusalem. There are perfumers, goldsmiths, priests, men of the plain, merchants, all contributing to the work of building the walls and gates. Each person contributes and leads their section. We see the power of delegation in the reaction of Judah's enemies. And we read that reaction in chapter 4. So if you would, we'll skip over chapter 3 and look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. This is after the work of rebuilding has begun. And we read starting in verse 1, it says, "But it so happened, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria, and he said, 'What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?' They are building the wall so quickly that the enemies are starting to take note. They even say mockingly, 'Will they complete it in a day?' Keep in mind that Jews have been back in Jerusalem for 13 years, but under Nehemiah's leadership, the work is getting done." Let's look at verse 6. In Nehemiah 4, verse 6, we read this. "So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work." It's a bit of an understatement on Nehemiah's part. If you look up some estimates of the archaeological evidence for the wall, depending on what you read, this really understates the progress that was made. Archaeological evidence suggests that the wall that Nehemiah built was likely 20 feet at its full height, several feet thick, and about 2 miles in circumference, meaning that they had repaired the wall to the height of probably about 10 feet and got it set up completely around the city very quickly. Let's look at point number 5. Point number 5 is that good leadership requires pivoting when challenges arise. Good leadership requires pivoting when challenges arise. In verse 7 through 11 of Nehemiah 4, we read that the progress they were making was upsetting Sanballat and the rest of Judah's enemies so much that they felt the only way to halt their progress was to kill the workers, causing discouragement and ultimately causing them to give up the project entirely. In verse 12, we read that Nehemiah was brought reports of the enemy's schemes 10 times. A different leader might have decided to stop the work and reevaluate. Some might have tried to excuse the work stoppage by claiming to value the Jewish people rather than some wall, but Nehemiah doesn't stop. He pivots. Let's look at that pivot in verses 16 through 23 of Nehemiah 4. We read what Nehemiah decides to do despite receiving these troubling reports. It says, "So it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor. And the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other they held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the rulers, and the rest of the people, 'The work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us.' So we labored in the work, and half the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time, I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing. Nehemiah had a job to do. The wall had sat in ruin for 13 years. So rather than stop to reevaluate, he pivoted to keep the work going. That pivot required sacrifice and collaboration on his part and the part of everyone involved in the project, but it kept the work going. Point number 6, good leadership takes personal sacrifice and leads by example. Good leadership takes personal sacrifice and leads by example. As we move from Nehemiah 4 into Nehemiah 5, we see Nehemiah facing down a new challenge unrelated to the building project that we have been reading about for the last few chapters. We read in verses 1 through 13, we read in verses 1 through 13 of Nehemiah 5, that the Jews had been facing a famine, and to buy grain they had to mortgage their homes and their lands to the nobles and rulers. The people come to Nehemiah because they no longer have the ability to buy grain, because everything they have belongs to the ruling class, and they have no more ability to make money. Nehemiah demands that the nobles and rulers restore the people's lands and their homes and 1/100th of the grain, money, wine, and oil that they had charged them. While they agree to Nehemiah's demands, Nehemiah doesn't just tell others what to do. We also see that he takes action himself. Let's look at Nehemiah's personal sacrifice. If we look at verses 14 through 18, we can see the example that Nehemiah sets for others. Nehemiah 5, verses 14 through 18, starting in verse 14, we read, Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work, and at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people. Nehemiah was appointed governor of Judah for 12 years, and for 12 years he didn't collect the money that he had legal right to. Those funds could have easily been justified given his obligations as governor to entertain local rulers, which we read was about 150 people, or visiting dignitaries beyond that. Nehemiah bore the responsibility at a great personal expense to set the proper example for those around him and ensure the prosperity of his people. His actions are reminiscent of the actions that Paul took with the Corinthian church. Let's again hold our place here in Nehemiah, and let's turn to 2 Corinthians. Let's read that example. We'll look at 2 Corinthians 11, verses 8 and 9. Second Corinthians 11, verses 8 and 9. Starting in verse 8, Paul says, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. And in everything, I kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so I will keep myself. Would it have been wrong for Nehemiah to take the governor's provisions, or for Paul to take wages from the Corinthian church? No. But they recognized that personal sacrifice was necessary for the people they were leading and put their people before their own needs. Finally, let's look at point number 7. Point number 7 is that good leadership will face personal opposition. Number 7 is good leadership will face personal opposition. In the case of Nehemiah, we've already read about some of the challenges to the project he was trying to institute. But those attacks weren't about Nehemiah personally. They were more about the progress he was making. We see a shift in Nehemiah chapter 6. In the first 4 verses, we read about Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem trying to get Nehemiah to leave the wall project and meet with them so that they could attack him. But when Nehemiah sees through their request, we read the following. Let's look at Nehemiah 6, verses 5 through 9. Nehemiah 6, starting in verse 5, we read, "Then Sanballat sent his servants to me as before, the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, 'It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says, that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king. So come, therefore, and let us consult together.' Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they all were trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands." Essentially, they threatened Nehemiah's leadership through lies, trying to claim that Nehemiah is usurping Artaxerxes' authority and making himself a king. But Nehemiah refuses to bow to their pressure. And their final attack is a spiritual one. In Nehemiah 6, verse 10 through 14, they try to trick Nehemiah into fleeing into the temple to save his life from an attack that was never going to come. Ultimately, Nehemiah faced personal opposition in 3 ways. Number 1, he faced threats to his physical life. Number 2, he faced threats to his reputation. And number 3, he faced threats to his spiritual standing. We must be aware of these attacks as well and stand strong, praying for God to strengthen us as Nehemiah did. There's a postscript to Nehemiah's story. It doesn't end in chapter 6. Thanks to Nehemiah's leadership, we read that the wall is finished in just 52 days. They completed the work so quickly that the surrounding nations saw it and gave God the credit, as they should have. In chapters 7 through 12, we read that thanks to Nehemiah and Ezra's leadership, exiles begin to return to Judah, the law is read, the holy days are reinstated, the people repent and sign a covenant to God, and proper practices are being put in place among the people and the priesthood. But then there is chapter 13. Let's cut into the middle of this story. We'll look at Nehemiah 13, verses 6 through 7. The very last chapter in the book. Nehemiah 13, and we'll look at verse 6. It says, "But during all this I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then after certain days I obtained leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God." This is a description of the priest Eliashib preparing a room in the temple for Tobiah, apparently allowing him to have a cozy little apartment within God's house. But that's not all. We also read that while Nehemiah had been away, the Levites hadn't been cared for and abandoned their responsibilities. There were people breaking the Sabbath by working on it. Foreign merchants were allowed to sell their goods in Jerusalem on the Sabbath, and Jews were marrying foreign wives and reintroducing pagan practices. We don't know how long Nehemiah was away, but it doesn't sound like a super long time. And in the absence of Nehemiah's strong leadership, in that short time, we see that pagan and evil practices had started to be reintroduced, and once again, he has to take a strong hand to restore the principles he had left them with when he returned to Persia. We read Nehemiah's final words in the last verses of Nehemiah. 13. We'll read those as our last verses for this message. Nehemiah 13, verses 30 and 31. Read, "Thus I cleanse them of everything pagan. I also assign duties to the priests and the Levites, each to his service, and to bringing the wood offering and the first fruits at appointed times. Remember me, O my God, for good." 6 times in the book of Nehemiah asked God to remember him for what he has done. God answered that prayer and preserved his legacy in this book that we've just reviewed so that we may remember him too. And not just remember him, but learn from him. Nehemiah demonstrated 7 principles of leadership that we can carry forward in our life, no matter our role or title. We are called to be kings and priests, leaders, and as such, we must learn how to lead as Nehemiah did.